I tried to find poets and artists that I think would be a good fit, but sometimes the artists have trouble finding imagery that works for them.
The Saginaw Art Museum's current exhibition, The Art of Poetry, Visually Reimagining the Poem, displays the results of a collaboration between Kalamazoo Book Arts Center, poets, and visual artists. I spoke with Executive Director Jeff Abshear and Studio Manager Katie Platte about the Poets Imprint program to learn more about the story of how these pieces came to be. I am here with Jeff Abshear and Katie Platte, and they are with Kalamazoo Book Arts Center and have agreed to come on the podcast here to talk a little bit more about poetry and the making of the broadsides that are currently in our graphic arts gallery. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff, maybe you can start just broadly explaining a little more about Kalamazoo Book Arts and the work that you're doing there. And then we can get a little bit more into this poetry collaboration and how that came about.
Sure. So we just celebrated our 15th anniversary this past year. And we are unique in the state of Michigan as a book art center. In fact, we are probably one of the largest, if not the largest, book art center in this part of the country. There are book art centers in other places, large cities. New York and San Francisco, Minneapolis are some examples of places that have large book art centers. We started this 15 years ago for a number of reasons. There was a history of the kinds of things that we do in Kalamazoo, a paper making history and a printing history, and the fact that this is a community that's organized around university. So we have a tradition of education, and a lot of very talented writers and artists live in Kalamazoo. So we, through very good luck, managed to acquire a bunch of equipment for doing all kinds of work that's related to the traditional way of making books. So we have a paper making studio where you can make paper by hand. We have mini letter presses, which are the machines that you use to print traditional movable type. So movable type means individual letters that you set words by hand and then put it on a press to print the pages. We have other equipment for doing other kinds of traditional printmaking, like etchings and engravings, woodcuts, linoleum cuts. And then in addition to that, we have a library, we have a gallery and area for doing presentations, and we have a store for selling the things that we make in our studio. So our mission is kind of multifold. Our intentions are to be a center for producing work, inviting artists and writers to collaborate in our studios, to make books and broadsides and other things with our equipment. And then we also focus on education. So we work with people of all ages, from elementary school kids through adults. We have programs for the local schools and libraries and youth groups to come in and make handmade paper, make prints, learn about letterpress printing, learn how to bind books. We have an internship program for high school and college age kids to come and work with us for several months to learn traditional techniques and how to make books. And then we offer workshops for the community. We have visiting artists that show in our gallery and offer workshops, as well as a group of local artists who teach for us. So we have a lot of things that we do at the Book Arts Center as a community organization.
Yeah, it sounds fairly comprehensive and broad in the scope of who you're serving and what your capabilities are. Really very interesting.
We serve, just focusing for a second on the youth programs. Of course, now this year has been disrupted, but in a normal year, we serve up to 1,000 elementary school kids a year that come into our studio and work with their teachers and make books by hand. So a lot of people.
And Katie, can you explain your role a little bit there?
Sure. I'm the studio manager at the Kalamazoo Book Arts Center. So I help set up the exhibits. I work closely with the interns. I teach. I help organize printing the broadsides and Poets in Print. I work on the website. I do a little bit of everything that needs to happen.
Many hats, right?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of the Poets in Print program, I'd love to hear more sort of about the genesis of that, how the idea came about. Poetry has a history of being printed, and now we're in this modern age where the physical print is much different than the digital distribution. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how Poets in Print came together.
So when we first started the Book Arts Center, and we had a whole lot of equipment that was donated to us, and big heavy presses and all this other stuff, and all kind of just landed in our space on pallets and just piles of equipment everywhere. And it took us, and that was in 2006 and 7. It took us a while just to get everything set up. But once we had the presses in place and functioning, we wanted to start producing work. We were interested in doing broadsides, but also books. And just out of a sort of a coincidence, we had an intern who was working for us at that time, who was from the English department at Western Michigan University. Her name was Nikita Cahoon. And she was a friend with one of the graduate students in the creative writing program there, Adam Clay. And Adam was interested in trying to organize poetry readings. And so through Nikita, Adam was introduced to us. We wanted to have poetry readings, but we wanted to add the addition of printing something that could commemorate these readings. And so Nikita was the first person to make a broadside for us. And in fact, that's one of the broadsides that's in the collection that you guys have in the gallery. When we first started this, our idea was to have 3 poets at the readings. So Nikita's broadside had 3 poets, Lily Brown, Amanda Nadelberg, and Joshua Marie Wilkinson. And then I can't remember, Katie, it was either you did the next one or I did the next one. We both did a broadside with 3. Do you remember if it was yours or mine?
I did 2 with 3, so it was probably around. Yeah. I mean, it was so long. I
know. Well, so we switched back and forth. So I did the next one, which is also in your collection, that's in your gallery, that has 3. Mine is the one that's doesn't have an image on it. It's more typographic, but it had 3 poets: Matt Hart, Roy Seeger, and Gina Myers. And then Katie did, as she said, a couple of ones with 3. And then we started to realize that it was really difficult to design a broadside with 3 poems on it. And we thought, well, we really should make just individual broadsides for each poet. 3 was a lot of poets for one reading. So we just, from then on, after we did the first 4 or so broadsides with 3 poets, we started doing individual broadsides for each poet and just asking 2 poets to read at each reading. So the first reading, which was the one that Nikita did, was in November of 2008. Then we did several more with 3. And then starting, I think, in 2009, we went to the format of doing 2 poets per reading. And we've pretty consistently been doing 5 or 6 readings a year, 2 poets at each reading. And now we have, after over a decade, over 120 or around 120 broadsides, I believe.
What was the reception like from the poets and artists to this idea? Did you meet any challenges or obstacles that they presented either in the production of the work or things like that?
Well, I'm going to give that to Kate, because she's the one that works most with the poets and the artists.
So I try to, I always read the poems and look at the artist's work before I match them together. So I try to find poets and artists that I think would be a good fit. But sometimes the artists have trouble finding imagery that works for them. And so that's a challenge. Another challenge is having the artists know and leave enough space for the physical poem on the broadside. So because we're printing everything by hand here at the Book Arts Center, they don't always mock it up right on their computer or in their sketches. So that can be one of the biggest challenges with printing something that someone made from far away.
So just to make clear, many or maybe even most of the poems are illustrated by artists who are not in Kalamazoo, but from someplace else. And so we do the collaboration long distance, sending things back and forth in the mail.
Yeah, so most of them do linoleum cuts because we're able to print those on our Vandercook presses because they're flatbread presses. And we can just mount them onto wood and print them pretty quickly. And they're easy to mail. So we can talk back and forth by email. They usually send me a sketch of what they want the finished project to look like. But yeah, most of the time they're not in our studio at all.
That's really interesting to consider the process and how that changes when you don't have direct access to the artist, or the artist doesn't have direct access to, seeing what that print looks like or how the modifications happen or need to happen. And tell me a little bit more about some of that back and forth with the artist and logistically what kinds of challenges you run into in that process.
So usually we have a list of all the things that they need to consider. So that weeds out some of the problems. We try to keep all of our broadsides the same size. There's certain sizes that the type is just going to be more legible at. So I would prefer if people try to design something where we can fit 14-point type. But the type looks different on their computer than it looks like when we're setting it by hand with our type. So even just tiny little differences in line length can make a big difference when we're printing. So we talk about that. Some artists just know what they want to do and get started and send me maybe one email saying that the plate is on the way. Other artists, I'm talking back and forth with them, working out like issues or if they have ideas about what kind of imagery they think would work well, but they're not sure. I talk about that. And basically it varies from broadside to broadside. And then the other issue or item on there is that they're only responsible for the image itself. And we set the type here. So usually our interns are setting the type, and it's goes through the press at least 3 times, one for the image, one for the type, and one for our logo, and sometimes even more times if there's multiple colors. Occasionally, artists will have access to a press of their own and produce the images for us, or they'll use an alternate process. So the one that Mary Wayland did, her broadside's in your exhibit, and it is a Blue Jay. And that one, she used a cyanotype for, which we don't do here at the Book Arts Center. So I just gave her the paper. She printed all of the images, and then we printed the type when it came back.
I'm going to add, sometimes the artist will make an image which is, something small or sort of floating at one part of the page, and it's very easy to put the type next to it or around it in some way. Other times the artist will fill the page with imagery or have like a solid background and will cut out a window for where the type is supposed to go. But that's why sometimes that can be a problem if they haven't anticipated quite enough room or thought about the fact that they'll need to be the title and the artist's name and the poet's name and the logo and all the other things that you have to squeeze into that little space. There have also been some artists who wanted their image to be printed on the entire sheet of paper, but in a very light color, and then have the type printed on top of their image. But there have been several times, for example, where the image is so complicated that if you print the type on top of it, you can't read the type. So we have at times resorted to printing on a very light white rectangle over their image to create a space that light, like wouldn't block out their image, but it would lighten their image more in that part of the page so that the print of the type can be read as well. So we have to be creative and resourceful with how to bring everything together into the final broadside.
Yeah. And another problem is sometimes artists don't understand what type can do. So I've had people, usually it's way ahead of time, asking me if I can have little bits of the poem all over the page and it fitting perfectly into their carved block. And that's just not possible. Or if it is possible, I would need a lot of time to figure out how to get all those pieces into the places. Setting type is fairly rigid and it, needs to be rectangular. And we also want to respect the line breaks and stanza breaks of the poet. So we try to avoid things like that.
It's really interesting to hear sort of this collaboration between not just the poet and the artist, but yourselves in the layout and how things come together, where you have this task of being a project manager of sorts to make sure that things go together, that the poet is developing the poem and the text, but you're providing some of that structure for the artist so that when it's all said and done, all these things match up. I'm love to hear more about the way that you decide how poems or poets and artists are matched up, and some of the idea behind how you go through that decision-making process and making sure that the poem and the artists have a good outcome. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Katie?
Sure. So basically in the summer, we get all of the poems and I usually have an open call for artists. So some of the artists, like I said, I don't even know at all. And some of them are from the area or friends that I know. And so when I look at their art, many of the poets write about nature, and that's really easy to set up with another artist. But sometimes, the poets write about more difficult subjects. So I usually look for artists that I think would be sympathetic to that, and usually send them an email saying, hey, these poems deal with rape and alcoholism or something like that. If you don't feel comfortable talking about this or making art about this, just let me know and I'll try to match you up with someone else. So it's just looking at their art and seeing, themes in the poetry that work.
And also I'd add, just in terms of how the poets are selected, I mentioned that Adam Clay was the person who started this with us, and he worked with us for a couple of years. He was in the graduate program at Western Michigan University in creative writing. And so he would choose the poets and schedule the readings. And then when Adam graduated and moved on and got a position at the University of Kentucky, Tracy Brimhall, who was in the creative writing program at Western, became the poetry coordinator. And she did the same work for several years. And then she also graduated and moved on. And then we had Michael Marbury. We've had several other graduate students. So we've gone through a list of different students from the graduate program who have coordinated the poetry selections for us. And when the poets are chosen, like Katie said, we do that. In fact, we're doing that right now for the next season. And then we ask for the poetry. They send us a selection of their poems, 5 or 6 poems. So that's what we give to the artists so that the artists can choose which of the poems that were submitted by the poet they want to make into the broadside. So that gives the artists a little bit more leeway in choosing a poem that they might particularly respond to.
I guess, it's interesting to hear some of that process in terms of the selection of those, the poets and the artists, and then matching them up and then matching the text up. Like this is a very, very much, we almost a group effort to get this thing launched. And so I'd love to hear what you have found maybe most rewarding about the work that you're doing in making these connections with the poets, with the artists, with the viewers. And I'd love to hear from each of you some of the reward in the process.
I'd say one of the things that I think is really satisfying about this is that I think I already mentioned the poets don't see the broadsides until the reading. So it's always a surprise for them. And I think sometimes, I don't go to all the readings, but Katie maybe could know this, but I would imagine that sometimes the poets have kind of even forgotten about the broadside and arrive, prepared to do a poetry reading just like they would do at any other poetry reading. And then I think that the pleasure of discovering that there's a stack of broadsides there that have been created in the months ahead of the reading is a surprise for them in some ways, or if nothing else, it's just a real thrill to see their work like that. And then we ask them to sit down and sign the stack of broadsides before they read. So I think that's a really unique experience for the poet, to come to a poetry reading and have that be a part of it.
Yeah, I agree. In the last reading, actually it's this reading right before it, Gina Franco read, and Amy Stevens made a broadside for her. And she was just so happy with the broadside and so thankful. And it's really exciting. And it's exciting to see that one, the imagery and the words came together so well. So it's also, to me, seeing something that works really well together on paper.
Yeah, it's sort of the culmination of the process and seeing it actually happen in a very physical form. I can imagine that's a really interesting moment.
Yeah, and it's been interesting. We've had our readings online for this year, and I am only able to show them, with screen share during Zoom. And so people miss the really physical aspects of the broadsides, like seeing the torn paper, feeling the impressions. But people are still really interested, and we've sold them and had questions about them, and it's been really nice.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of the way that things may have been different this past year because of the change in the way we're communicating and the difference between a physical object and the digital object. With poetry, it's maybe similar to seeing something printed versus hearing it read. Like there's a difference between those because I might not necessarily know what the poet sounds like in my head when I read it. And I wonder if some of that sort of happens with the work that you're doing in terms of trying to share the artist's work and the poet's work in a digital sense when really it belongs in a physical space.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I agree. There's a digital, picture or copy is not going to be the same at all as a physical broadside. And it's too bad. But this year has been really great for our poetry readings in different ways because we've expanded our audience a lot by having them digital. So even though less people are physically seeing what we do, and it's also weird, usually our poetry readings are actually in our space. So people can wander around and see our equipment and ask questions about how things are printed or why we have so much type. And this time, every time that I start a poetry reading, I have to start by saying, introducing that we're from the Kalamazoo Book Arts Center, what the Kalamazoo Book Arts Center is, and what they're not seeing that they normally be seeing if they're in our space. So I think it's not just the physical piece of art that they're losing. They're also losing the whole atmosphere of what it's like to be in a book art center that does papermaking and printing. But I mean, there's definitely pros and cons. It's been really great to have a larger audience and have poets read that might not have been able to come to Kalamazoo otherwise. So it's been an interesting year, just like it has for everybody.
It's been, so we get an audience that's from a much, farther away. So as a result of that, we're already talking about, we're probably in the fall, or definitely in the fall when we start doing readings again. We're going to stay online for now. Later in the spring, we hope to go back to in-person readings, but we're already talking about and exploring the idea of doing both, of setting up video to record the in-person sessions so that they can be live streamed at the same time, so we can still reach that larger audience. I also wanted to mention that I don't know if this is quite true, but it does seem to me like we've sold a lot of broadsides from the readings this year, more than usual. And I think maybe part of the reason for that has something to do with what Katie was describing. Not being able to see the physical thing, I think, makes people want to see it. So which is maybe why they, push the button to buy one. Curiosity about seeing the physical thing and having it arrive in the mail.
Yeah, there's a craving for closeness with the artwork, right? That maybe people didn't realize that they had before because just took it for granted. And hopefully we don't take it for granted so much, myself included. Now that you've been creating these broadsides for more than a decade, tell me maybe one or two lessons that you've really learned from the experience broadly, whether that's working with the community and with the public, or working with the artists and poets. What are some things that you feel like you've learned through this experience?
We need to plan things way ahead.
Yeah, I know. I was sort of laughing because give people deadlines and
make them really soon. We have had some really close calls in the past in terms of getting the broadsides done, like literally the broadside being printed the day before the reading.
And some of that is definitely not people's fault. Like my friend from France did a broadside for us and sent it, and it just took forever with the French mail. So, it's a lot of factors there. But we've had a lot of close calls.
So we have to plan things way in advance, which is why we get started now for the broadsides for next year. We hope to be printing some of the broadsides this summer, long before the readings even are anywhere near time for the reading.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I have a friend who always says that we're bad estimators of how long things take, and that generally they take longer than we expect, and when they don't, there's a surprise there. Like, oh, look, really? It worked. And I can imagine, especially with the number of moving pieces and parts that you have in this process, that's
and actually, I could sort of tie this back to something that you mentioned before, which is how collaborative this whole process is. It's not just the process of the poet and the artist, but also the poet, the artist, and the printers, which is, that's a sort of microcosm of the history of printing in general. Printing books and broadsides is a collaborative art, and it always has been. It's involved a lot of different creative people. When you consider, the paper makers and the bookbinders and all the people, the compositors and the printers and the the people that set the type and put the type away. And it's always been a collaborative art, which is one of the reasons why we built a book art center, because we wanted a community center where people could work together and make things like books and broadsides. In fact, I would even mention that we also, in addition to making the broadsides, we also work on limited edition books. We've got several that have already been completed. We've got a couple of others that are in process of we're working on right now. And of course, that's an even more labor-intensive, time-consuming process.
Yeah, it's notable that nothing is happening in isolation, even within the center there. That we've talked about the poets and the artists in the center, but even within the center, your description of the roles that people have to make things happen is important. Everybody is contributing to that process, and there's a lot of hands that are working towards a singular goal.
Yeah, and I usually kind of head what's going on here with the printing. But we'll have interns set the type. We'll have interns printing. Since most of the broadsides are in different colors, like at least black for the text and a color for the image, multiple interns will print the broadsides. Different people will tear down the paper. So, there's at least probably 4 or 5 people working on them at the center when they get here.
In closing here, I would love to hear each of you just sort of comment with a word of encouragement to people that are working on collaborations more broadly, whether that's music artists and visual artists or, other types of collaboration for projects. If there's some word of encouragement that you can provide to those that are working together, what would that be?
Well, I think that it's nice to be part of something that's larger than yourself. That you have a place to or something to contribute towards a final goal that will be the summation of a lot of different people's work. As a printer, for example, I think that one of the things that I try to do in my work, or the part of the work that I do for these the projects that we do, is to create something that elevates the work of the artist and the poet, so that my job is like a clear piece of glass. It's something that it's like the pedestal that the other two people sit on. And to me, that's really satisfying, to not be required to insert my ego into it, or whatever creative part that I put into it is hidden in a way, and is only used to highlight the creative work of the other people involved. So there's a kind of self-negation there, but it also feels good because it's part of a greater whole.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the less that I am there and you can see that I'm doing it, the better it is. And I don't feel always like I'm collaborating, because I really want everyone else's work to show more than my hand.
Well, Jeff, Katie, thank you so much for the discussion today. It's been really interesting to learn more and hear the way that you are working together in your humble ways here. That, as we've heard, that I think that's a very interesting closing note. And, when we see these finished pieces, it's interesting to understand that there are many that are behind them. So thank you very much.
I look forward to coming in, seeing the exhibit in May.
Thank you for listening to the Saginaw Art Museum podcast. You can stay connected with the museum through our website and social media channels. We invite you to become a subscriber of this podcast or become a monthly contributor to the show to help us carry out our mission of providing art for all.